Good evening all, and welcome. Before we commence with tonight's hospital horrors, I would just like to give a shout out to my good friend Briefcase. He's uploaded another terrific video today, and it is a really chilling case. Now, the only reason I mention this is because he's 100 subscribers short of 5,000. Which is, of course, something he really wants to hit before the new year. We have about 24 hours, or slightly less, before it's New Year's in England, and it would really mean a lot if you would click the link in the description or at the end of the video, when the video's over preferably, and check out his channel and possibly subscribe if you enjoy his content. He does true crime stuff, but it's not cases you'd usually heard of. He goes for really old or really unheard of cases. So big shout out to him. Feel free to check him out. It really would mean the world to me, and I'm sure it would make his year if he ended it with a bang by hitting 5k. Thank you everyone, but for now it's time to get comfortable and let the doctor take control. I work in a level 1 trauma center, so we have a lot to do with the follow-up and stabilization of the crazy incidents that the paramedics have to deal with. First, I just want to give a shout out to all the first responders. You're all awesome and make emergency medicine a hell of a lot easier. IR wouldn't be able to function without your hard work. So, onto the story. It was a busy day in our 60-bed emergency department. Later in the afternoon, we get a call from our communication center, saying that one of our life fighter helicopters is bringing in a level 1 trauma from a motor vehicle accident. Hot offload, 15 minutes, loud broadcasts overhead alerting the department of the oncoming patient, and the trauma teams assemble. Radiology, technicians, phlebotomy, 3 trauma-certified nurses, trauma residents, and the trauma surgeon. I finished the EKG I was doing on my current patient, and I headed into the trauma bay to wait for the flight team to come in. A few minutes later I hear, "She's here," and the flight team come flying around the corner, pushing a stretcher as fast as they can. The flight nurse is on top of the stretcher doing chest compressions. This young woman, not even 30, was in cardiac arrest, and they had been working on her for the last 20 minutes. Beyond that, she really looked like shit. The back of her head was split open and she was losing a lot of blood. We continued working on her for another 20 minutes before regaining a pulse. At that time, we overheard a broadcast for a level 2 pediatric trauma, her 2-year-old son. A few minutes later, EMS arrived with the son, who is actually in fairly good shape considering he was just in a horrible car accident. The right car seat really can save lives. Unfortunately, roughly 10 minutes after the child arrived, we lost the pulse on his mum again and were unable to get it back. I remember hearing the trauma surgeon shaking his head and saying, "Man, that's really disappointing," and looking at the resident next to me, and the only thing I was able to say was, "Well, that kid next door doesn't have a mum anymore." The mum had taken a handful of benzos and crashed the car. I was dispatched to a pretty big hospital ER in Los Angeles to do a psych transport to a psychiatric facility. The call was for a female in her mid-30s, and the information given by dispatch was very minimal. All we really knew was that she had attacked her husband. My partner and I arrived at the hospital, and before we reached the patient, Her handling nurse, a seasoned ER nurse who works in a pretty rough area of LA, takes us aside as if to separate us from the rest of the ER staff, and tells us with the most stone-cold serious face that this patient scares her and that we need to be extra careful. So we're a little like, okay, what do you mean? Well, she goes on to say that they have her in the 4-point restraints and she needs to stay in them. Okay, that's nothing new. The nurse then tells us what the events leading up to our patient's stay in the ER were. The patient's husband had come home from work the day before, and as soon as he walked in through the door, she attacked him with a butcher knife and stabbed him up pretty good. He lived and managed to get away. He called the cops, who arrested her at the residence. She was still there about an hour after the initial attack, still holding the knife, and just sitting there on the floor covered in blood. The cops arrested her, and she didn't even put up a fight. Super compliant. But she also never said a single word. Not to her husband, and not to the cops or hospital staff. She just stared at them, as if she was unsure of how to speak. The husband later said that he had no idea why she attacked him. The nurse says to my partner and I that she believes with all her heart that this lady is possessed. Okay, that's a little bit extreme in my opinion, but sure. So we enter the room, and the patient is laying on her back and restrained at the ankles and wrists. The bed is laid out flat, but she's kind of sitting up in a semi-Fowler's position, a kind of 45-degree angle. It's super unnatural looking, and not easy to do for a long time. The weirdest part was that as I entered the room, the patient was already looking at me with these wide, unblinking eyes, like she knew I was about to walk into the room. My partner and I start to do our thing, getting vitals, and start obtaining the report and whatnot. The entire time, this lady has her gaze locked on me. She moves slowly too, like the way a praying mantis does little eye dot movements very intentionally. We have to undo her restraints so that we can move her onto our gurney. We tell her, and she just stares. She moves over without a fight, and as we begin to redo her restraints on the gurney, I restrained her right sides while my partner restrained her left side. We get her loaded into the ambulance without incident and begin our drive to the psych hospital. I'm attending this day, so that means I'm in the back of the ambulance with the patient while my partner gets to drive. The ride starts off smooth, no issues really other than this lady's unblinking stare. I take a seat at the bench on the patient's left side and continue to work on my report. And that's when I hear it. This wet, repetitive sound. I look and see my patient is still staring at me. Her eyes are wide and her face expressionless, but her left hand is ferociously flicking the bean with serious intent. She would be at risk of starting a fire had she not been wetter than a rainstorm. What the hell? I couldn't help but react with a host of expletives, and my partner yelled back, "What's wrong?" She's masturbating." What? You left her restraint loose. Drive faster. I moved to jump seat, located at her head, so to avoid splash damage. But despite the odd angle, this lady twisted her head just enough to stare me down as she went to town on her nether regions. She eventually stopped and decided to end the destruction of my innocence with a thorough drenching of the gurney and ambulance floor with healthy yellow pee. We were dropping her off at the facility, and she got up from the gurney and for the first time broke her soul-piercing gaze to look down at the mess she'd made. She looked back up at me and said, "Sorry." I was working a night shift at a hospital in West Texas and have a few stories from there. This wasn't actually me, but my co-worker, a rapid response, was called that this patient needs immediate attention from doctors, nurses, and all kinds of staff to try and fix the problem at hand. After the problem was handled and staff started exiting the room, the patient asked my co-worker, "Where did the little boy go?" To which he responds, "What little boy?" "The little boy that was here in the room with me. He left after everyone started running in here, but he had been sleeping at my feet." That was a bit creepy. On another occasion, I was taking care of an older woman in her late 50s with mental retardation. She could hardly speak, even though she tried very hard to iterate a few simple words. Occasionally, I would make stuff out like water or bathroom. On one occasion, she said, "Boy." "Boy?" I asked. "Yes," she replied. "Is there a little boy in here?" "Yes," she said again. I was a little creeped out, because I couldn't see anything, but her eyes kept moving around, as if they were following said little boy. I came back into her room 4 hours later to help clear out her secretions, because she was having some trouble breathing. I'm setting up all my suction equipment when she says, "Boy," again. I asked, "Is the boy here again?" And she replies by reaching out her hand and pointing as if the boy was walking across the room, only to stop right behind me. At which point, I nope right out of there and collect myself. I finally calmed down and did what I had to do, but this encounter convinced me that ghosts were real. How can an older woman with severe mental retardation who barely speaks know how to lie about something like that? Finally, I was in a room with the nurse assistant. Mind you, the patient was in her early 50s and very sound of mind. As the assistant began taking her vitals, she asked her, "Is that a girl or boy?" Seeing as I'm the only other person there, she replies, "She's a girl." While I sulk there being incredibly offended by potentially being confused for a boy, she says something like, "Oh, children are such angels." The nurse assistant leaves the room while I stay behind giving the patient a respiratory treatment. Where did the little girl go? "What?" I say. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see her." At which point I realise it was probably the little ghost boy, and we had thought she had been referring to me. "Yeah, the little girl that was in here with us. She was standing right next to you, eating something in her hands. It looked like a burrito." I did the reasonable thing and lied right to her face. I told her it was probably someone's child from the visiting families, even though it was 4:30 in the morning. I didn't want to be scaring people by being like, "Oh yeah, we have this ghost kid wandering around the floor." But then she replies, "Oh, that makes sense. I can still hear her laughing and playing around outside the hall." I was working in a hospital in the Midwest. At one point during the night, we had a patient come up to the nurse's station. We told her that she should have rang on her bell, but she insisted it was urgent, that there was a woman in her room and she couldn't get her out. I told my fellow nurses that I would deal with this, and as I was walking back, I asked her what the problem was. She said that she'd been asleep, but at some point in the night, a lady had entered her room. The thing about the lady is that she had this huge pole in the middle of her chest, completely impaled, and looked a mess, like she'd escaped from one of the trauma centers or something. I gave her a puzzled look, knowing that this was incredibly unlikely, but went along with the patient and made my way to the room. When I opened the door to the room, to my absolute not surprise, there was no one there. The patient seemed to have all their mental faculties before, as we'd spoken a few times, so this was a little bit out of character. But I tried to push it under the rug and forget about it. I didn't ask any more questions, and once I had confirmed that the room was free of whoever was there before, she was on her merry way to sleep. I went back and asked my fellow nurses if there would be a possibility to check the security tapes, as there had been an alleged infringement of her space with someone going into the room. So, we went and spoke with some of the technicians who told us that they would have a look for us. I got a call back the next day while on my shift, letting me know that there had been no one in that room, and the lady had gotten up, looked, and then left the room. I found it comforting to know, so I didn't bother reviewing the tapes myself. A few weeks go by, and this time it's a completely new patient in a different room. Same thing happens. This time, the buzzer goes off at the nurse's station, and I make my way down there to see what was going on. Maybe this person needed assistance going to pee or something. I get there, and this guy is just standing in the corner of his room, looking absolutely bewildered at the other side of the room. I open the door, and where I opened it, the corner he was staring at would be right behind me. I started approaching him, and he let out a shriek, and I told him to calm down and that nothing was wrong. I managed to get my hands on his and looked him dead in the eyes and asked him what the problem was. He started sinking onto the ground, crying, and I was a bit unsure what was going on. Fear draws me in, and I turn around just to make sure there's no axe murderer behind me, and I'm in the room alone with him. So calmly, I manage to get him back to his senses, and when he finally can speak again, he tells me that he woke up in the middle of the night and saw a woman who had some kind of fence lodged into her chest, a pole of some kind, and that there was blood everywhere. At this point, I connect the dots, and I feel my jaw drop and my heart sink. Could it have happened again? Surely not. This was quite a while ago. So, I tell him calmly that the person is gone now, and that he need not worry, and that they wouldn't be back. I close the door, after making sure that he's okay one final time, and make my way back to the nurse's station. I start talking to them, saying if they know anything about someone being impaled, and that this was the second time that someone had spoken to me about them. Some of the nurses look at me confused, completely unsure what I'm speaking about. But then, Mandy pipes up. She said that she hadn't experienced this firsthand, but that someone told her this story when she first started. Years ago, in the 80s or something, there was a lady who was driving her car drunk and hit some kind of fence. She did a lot of damage, and one of the fence posts impaled into her chest. She was rushed to the hospital and got here still alive, but unfortunately, they weren't able to save her, and she died here. They've said that since that day, some people report seeing her in the corner of the room, or just staring at them in the middle of the night. It doesn't happen frequently, but when it does, there's bound to be a death on the ward. Well, as it happened, that same patient died the day after. But the last patient I'm referring to made a full recovery and left pretty quickly. I'm not sure whether I believe it or not. I didn't bother to ask to see the tapes, as I felt thoroughly creeped out and wasn't sure if I'd like what I got to see. I'm just gonna hope it's not true, but if it does happen again, I'll let you guys know. Some backstory. I have worked on and off at a psych hospital for the past 9 years. It used to be a regular hospital, but eventually it was bought out and turned into a standalone psych facility. For the most part, I have worked overnights on the children's unit, which used to be the maternity ward when it was the old hospital. The main part of the unit is a hallway with a nurse's station, bedrooms, a day room, and a quiet room. The quiet room is just a small empty room that can be used as the timeout for the kids, or locked seclusion if necessary. Overall, it was a pretty cake job. I would get to work 15 minutes early and finish everything I needed to do for the night as fast as possible, and then post up in a big comfy chair at the end of the hallway and read a book or watch Netflix on my phone until it was time to wake all the kids up. In my 9 years there, I've had a lot of creepy and paranormal experiences, but the one I am referring to today are the ones I've always considered to be real, because it wasn't me that experienced them, but the patients in our unit. One night, between 3 and 4 a.m., a very young patient comes out of his room because he was having trouble sleeping. We let him take his pillows and blankets and set up a mat on the floor of the quiet room so that he could lay down in there. He stayed in there for almost an hour. He then brought his pillows and blankets near me and sat down. Since patients are supposed to just chill in the hallway, I told him he needed to go back to the quiet room, and he listened. A few minutes later, he came back out, and this time the nurses came out of the nurses' station and told him that he needed to go back to the quiet room or to his own bedroom. The patient returned to the quiet room, and a few minutes later came out again and sat down by me. I didn't really care if this kid was in the hallway or not, but I knew the nurse did, so I told him that he'd better get to the quiet room and go to sleep, otherwise he'd wind up getting himself in trouble. When I said that, the kid started to cry his eyes out and said, "I can't." When I asked him why, he said it was because there was a man in the quiet room staring at him. At this point I was like, okay, whatever, stay here, and did not think much of it. Fast forward about 6 months later, we had a patient on our unit that was a lot more mature than most patients we ever had. He really should have been on the teenager unit, but he was just shy of the age limit, so we were stuck on the unit with the little kids half his age. Anyway, he would wake up around the same time every night, around 3 or 4, and be unable to fall back asleep. He would stand in the doorway and talk to me, and I never really would give him any issues about it because he was pretty chill, and it gave me a break from staring at my book or phone. One night, in the middle of our conversation, he abruptly asked me, "Who is standing in the quiet room?" And when I said, "No one," his face went pale. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me that he swore he saw a man standing there from the quiet room door, and when he looked back, After asking me who it was, the man was gone. I told him the story about the little kid who told me he saw the man staring at him in the quiet room. We both had a good chill down our spines, and the kid said screw this and went back to his room. So, fast forward again about a year or two, and we have this little girl in our unit, and she was just non-stop chaos. Very, very tiny, and couldn't speak a single word that makes sense, just garbled sounds, always trying to bite and scratch us, and seemingly never slept. Everyone would say that she was possessed. She definitely wasn't. Anyway, one night after being bitten and scratched for hours straight, she was finally ordered into locked seclusion in the quiet room. It was about 15 to 20 minutes before she started screaming bloody murder and pounding her hands on the door to the point where her hands started bleeding. We let her out of the quiet room immediately, and as soon as we unlocked the door, she burst through it, pointing at the room, screaming, "The boy, the boy, the boy!" Certainly put a scare in me, as it made me remember the other two patients who said they saw someone in the quiet room. After everything was calmed down, I grabbed some rags and disinfectant spray to clean the door after the kid pounded on it. I felt very uneasy going into the room after the kid had just been screaming the boy, and just beat her fists bloody to get out of there. So when I opened the door back up, I slowly stuck my head inside, fully expecting to see a ghost or something. The room was empty. But right after I pulled my head out of the room and opened the up winder so I could get inside, the light inside the room went out. I noped out of there and let someone else clean that crap up. Anyway, I found it very, very chilling to work there. I'm a bit disappointed I never experienced anything paranormal myself. I have lots of creepy stories from the hospital, as well as my own life. It's definitely incredibly unsettling. I am a night shift nurse in a semi-rural hospital. I've had two very creepy things happen to me. One of our patients had recently died, and his family members left after spending some time with his body. So we do the post-mortem care and take him down to the morgue. We didn't get any more admissions that night, so it was empty until we left. The thing is, the call bell from that room would keep ringing at random times. We went in there to make sure it wasn't just under something, but no one was in there messing with it, because the room was right across from the nurse's station. I still can't explain that. Tonight I'm working. One of my patients is very ill, and she was yelling out because she said someone was looking at her from the anteroom. The anteroom is a little room next to the isolation rooms so that we can put our isolation gowns in. It's typically used for TB patients, if we have any, and serves as a little gateway to negative pressure rooms so that infection will stay in the room. Anywho, I figured it was maybe her dementia or something. The thing is, I didn't know until later that her daughter had also seen something in the anteroom yesterday. Her daughter was serious as well. We've been keeping a very close eye on that patient because we're pretty sure she's not going to make it through the night. Every time we go in there, other nurses or aides get deep chills and don't want to go back in. I worked in dispatch in the basement of the hospital. I was working the night shift, and I was alone. I had the door closed, and there is a key code needed to unlock the door. I am the only one in my corridor of the basement at this time. I heard over the intercom that there was a code yellow, which is missing patient, from the mental health floor. I have no idea how he got out, but now he was roaming the hospital. About 10 minutes later, the door handle started shaking, and someone was trying to get in. I stayed completely still until it stopped, then got up and looked through the peephole. There was a man just sitting against the wall, wearing a hospital gown. I went back down to my desk and called security, and I spoke as quietly as I could so that he wouldn't hear and run away. Security came, and I heard them take him away. He was yelling all sorts of stuff that didn't make sense, and was clearly resisting them. A guard came in afterwards and asked if I was okay, and I told him I was fine, thanks to the door lock. This isn't my story, but my mom who told me this story many times and never changed a detail. My mom has been a nurse for 30 years. She told me she's literally seen people's spirits leave their bodies in a white mist. She says people between worlds when they are here, but you can tell they're somewhere else, and they talk about people who have passed on. She told me that she'd seen people pass with a smile and in terror, which is why she believes in heaven and hell. Anyway, this is my favourite story of hers. She was staffing the nurses' station in a nursing home on an overnight shift. At around 1 a.m, an old lady comes to ask for some water. She tells her that she will send, and the old lady leaves. My mum calls a co-worker and asks for her to fetch the water. At 2 a.m, the old lady is back asking for water. My mum tells her to go back to her room and asks the co-worker once again. At 3 a.m, same thing. My mum's now pissed that nobody's taken the woman water and flips out. My co-worker says to her that the old lady had died earlier in the night. A few years ago, some friends convinced me to go camping with them in the woods. It seemed like a great idea at the time, and me, never having been camping before, decided to go along with it. So, the day came, and we all decided to pack our own snacks and foods. Note, this part is important. I have a very, very bad reaction if I ever have nuts. The allergy is so severe that I think I could die if I have too many. That's how bad. Point being, I always carry an EpiPen just in case. So, keep that in mind. We go into the woods, start doing our trek, and after a while find a suitable place to make camp. We put up the tent, which was a bit more fun than I anticipated, and start building a fire to keep warm so that we can drink a few beers, share our food, and have general chit-chat. Now, my friend is a bit of a foodie and goes to these fancy bakery and farmers markets to get all this fresh fancy food. And we love her for it. But as with most food like that, it's hard to ascertain the ingredients in those foods. I'm pretty sure you can see where this is going. And yep, it went straight there. So, we're eating and just having a good time. She pulls out this bread. I can't remember what it was, but admittedly, it was delicious. She starts going on about how she got it from a guy and this and that and the other, and we're all just munching down this bread in between ham. It's really good. And then after about a minute, I start to feel tingly. That horrible feeling. My throat starts feeling like it's about to close, and I realize I'm having a really bad allergic reaction. I never did find out what exactly was in that bread or how, but I'm pretty sure it was a nut of some description, one that I'm allergic to, and it absolutely ruined me. I started finding it hard to breathe, and when we went to try and look for my EpiPen, it was nowhere to be found. I must have forgot to pack it like a moron. I was annoyed that this was happening, mostly because I didn't want to be the buzzkill of the group, and I was trying to tell myself that it wasn't that bad, and that it could just go away on its own. But as the symptoms started to get worse very quickly, my friends realized this was an emergency. Thank God that we weren't that far because we're lazy shits, and we managed to make it to the car quickly. At some point en route, I passed out, and remember waking up at some point the next morning, feeling like absolute crap. Turns out, my friends had managed to get me to the hospital on time, just enough to save my life. Any slower, and I could have died. Shit like that is serious. I spent another 2 days in the ICU just to make sure that everything was going to be fine. I'm glad to say that it was. But now I'm a bit more careful when it comes to eating food like that, and I recommend anyone with a similar condition to keep it in mind. Feeling like your life is about to end is not a fun experience, and having to stay in a hospital really worried me, as it made me think that maybe something was going to happen again, and that I was at a risk of dying once more. Stay safe out there. I worked security in the emergency ward of a hospital, and the one thing I never understood was drunks. People who staggered into the emergency ward expecting medical attention simply because they were drunk and nothing else. And they always have a bunch of retarded friends with them that make the cast of The Hangover look like a Mensa convention. You gotta help my friend. He's drunk. And tomorrow he'll be sober. What's the problem? This is where the medical degree kicks in. He might have alcohol poisoning. Right. The guy who staggered in here from several blocks away has alcohol poisoning? Let me illuminate you. The guy who was brought in here flat on his back in an ambulance with an EM team struggling to keep his heart beating, that's the guy who got alcohol poisoning. Not any person who walked in here under their own power. But he's throwing up. Good. That means that there'll be less alcohol in his system. Better drink some water because he's getting dehydrated. Oh hell, he can't drink water. Right, of course. For God's sake, don't do anything that actually makes sense. Screw the water. By the way, in this part of the conversation, where people discover there actually isn't a pill on standby in emergency rooms that cures people of drunkenness, and when you inform them of this, their reaction is one of absolute incredulity. What do you mean there's no pill for drunk? There's no pill. It doesn't exist. No one ever invented one, and if it did, we wouldn't waste our times keeping it in the ER. You would probably get it from a pharmacist. ERs are for emergencies, not for curing drunkenness. Now, when you inform people that there's no such pill, they have one of two reactions. One, such a pill does exist and we're too ignorant to keep it in stock, therefore all their tax dollars that pay for emergency services are a giant waste of money. Or two, we do have a pill in stock but we're lying about it because we're unreasonable jerks. So they have to beg or plead harder or threaten us with physical violence to get their hands on a pill that they're convinced must exist. Now, when the pill thing has been played out, drunks either leave, but a few come down with this revelation. Give him a blood transfusion to get the alcohol out of his system. Oh, blood! Right, you mean that stuff we desperately need to keep people from dying? No blood transfusions. I don't have a clue if that would actually work, but we're not wasting our most valuable resource just to spare some drunks from a hangover. God damn, people can be so irritating when it comes to that. Please, don't go to the ER if you're drunk. Sleep it off. and hydrate. I work as an ICU nurse. A mid-20s female came in with some serious cardiac abnormalities and then went into respiratory distress. Never had any medical history at all. We had to put her on the ventilator, but she was on just enough sedation to keep her lucid. She could nod and shake her head to answer questions with yes and no. One night, the patient in the room next to hers died, but the body was still in the room, about to be taken to the morgue. The female patient's door was closed with curtains down, so she couldn't have seen what was going on in the next door. When I went in to check on her, she had a look of sheer panic on her face, trembling. I asked her a series of questions to see if she was cold, hot, or in pain, to which she denied all. I asked her if she saw something, and she started to aggressively nod her head. She wasn't on any drugs that would make her hallucinate. I went on to get details on what this thing looked like, and after playing 20 questions I got this. Man, pale white, left arm missing, heavy, bald, standing still, behind me. This was the man who just died next door. I spent the rest of the night consoling her. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's video on hospital stories. Just as I said at the start, it would really mean a lot to me if you guys could check out my good friend Briefcase. He's just 100 subs shy of that 5k target, which would mean a lot if he would hit it before the new year. He's actually just launched a really good new video. I'm going to leave it on the link on screen now so that you could potentially check it out, and please do, it's really good. I'm going to leave it there just to give you a little bit more time to maybe see that video. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.